If I were to ask you what your favorite letter was, now think about it for a little bit. Does this letter belong somewhere in your first or last name? If it does, that's okay. There's nothing abnormal about you. But this is one of the many theories that Sigmund Freud articulated in his psychological heyday. Born in Austria, Sigmund Freud was a psychologist and a neurologist who studied and made the first psychoanalytic theories. These theories gave way to a new approach to psychology known as the psychodynamic. Now, Freud's theories have often been dubbed inconsistent and unreliable, despite their frequent use in psychology today. This is because it's often difficult for psychodynamic psychologists to prove their findings to the scientific world. So this begs the question, why should psychologists even reference the psychoanalytic theory in their field today? Well, I can say I confidently believe that the ideas and theories set in place by Sigmund Freud are foundational to modern psychology and relevant today. I'll explain why I believe that and more about the argument, but first I'd like to give you more context into this, in case you haven't heard of it before. Sigmund Freud was born in 1856 in Austria. He studied at the University of Vienna, where he studied medicine. He began as a neurologist at the beginning of his career, but then the idea of hypnosis got him thinking about psychology, and then will eventually give way to the beginnings of psychoanalytic theory. From there erupted a new approach to psychology known as the psychodynamic. So now that we know that Freud was the father of the psychodynamic, what exactly did he teach? I'll go into that. So the psychodynamic focuses primarily on sub and unconscious thoughts and desires as our primary incentives for behavior. A handful of psychodynamic terminology that you might have heard before, to give you a little bit more context on this, would be Freudian slips for the first. Freudian slips would be if you were walking with your boyfriend or your girlfriend and you accidentally called them by your ex's name, whereas in most social situations we'll write this off as a force of habit. Freud believed that this was actually maybe due to unconscious desires or thoughts about that person that were just coming to light through verbal communication. The next one would be the psychodynamic theory on dreams, which was pretty simple, but what they believed is that, or what they still believe, is that dreams were the presentation of unconscious thoughts and desires into our subconscious mind. Finally, a last bit of terminology here is psychotherapy. And even if you don't know what that means, you can picture it in your head. You can see the therapist sitting there with a pen and a paper, the patient lying next to them in an odd, uncomfortable looking couch, ranting about whatever's bugging them in their lives. Well, that's psychotherapy. Now that you know a little bit more about some of the psychoanalytic theories, I want to talk about how some of these bold theories stay relevant in psychology as well as in social practice. John Kilstrom, a professor at the University of Arizona, created a website describing psychoanalytic theory. He discusses the importance of psychoanalysis in psychology today in this following quote. The attempt to link psychoanalysis with scientific psychology must always be interesting, if for no other reason than that there are so many different forms of psychoanalysis, and thus so many ways to make connections. Psychoanalytic theories, although lacking in hard evidence, stay relevant today for the new dimension of thinking it presents to psychology that rivals any before it, other than maybe introspection. Psychoanalysis is not all just wacky theories and a failure in hard evidence. There is a practical use for it. In the Journal of Social Work Practice, authors Susan Bliss and Brian Rasmussen articulate the importance that psychodynamic has posed to them in clinical social work. They also address the false claim that psychodynamic strategies are reserved solely for privileged individuals in social work. They say in this following quote, dispelling any myth that these theories are applicable to a restricted group of privileged clients, or that we have forgotten the importance of person and environment in social work. Social professions, from clinical social work to psychiatry, have benefited greatly from psychodynamic. So with such a practical use as well as a use in psychology, why is there still indecision regarding what should be done with the psychodynamic approach and the psychoanalytical theories? Well, when one of the greatest and misconceived notions about these is actually regarding Freud himself. Somewhat of a womanizer in his day, as well as a declared atheist, made him not really a very popular scientist. But even with his nasty quirks, one cannot deny the influence he's had on our culture. Even the word Freudian means relating to the unconscious. From defense mechanisms to dreams, what Freudian's theories put an emphasis on is vital and relevant to the further discovery of our minds. So with all this indecision with psychoanalysis and how it can be used in professional work as well as in psychology, where can the answer be found? The answer is, it is up to you. As individuals, and the only ones completely aware of our own subjective experiences, we all qualify to a degree or another as psychologists. So, when you are debating whether or not to qualify the psychodynamic approach as a valid scientific school of thought, just ponder on this question. Do you believe the unconscious part of our minds to be driving factors as the incentives for our behavior? If yes, then cast out all previous prejudice regarding Freud or psychoanalysis and focus on what is important. Regardless, however, if you do truly agree with these theories or not, they are still frequently referenced in psychology today and thus have yet to fade from scientific study. To conclude, I'd like to review some of the main points I've gone over so far, beginning with talking about Freud and his upbringings, as well as the very beginnings of psychodynamic approach. Then we talked about the approach itself and its many theories and the overall beliefs of them. Then I taught about the importance of the psychodynamic in psychology for the new dimension it creates at looking in that study, as well as the practical use for it in most social professions. Freud, although a controversial figure, did create an outside-the-box approach to psychology that has not been matched yet, which keeps him relevant despite some of his nasty quirks. Finally, I talked about how the decision of whether to subscribe or not to the beliefs of psychoanalysis and the psychodynamic as a whole is truly and completely up to yourself as an individual, but the reference to psychology today does stay the same. Psychodynamic has influenced many fields of study and work. From psychiatry to therapy to clinical social work, it can hardly be ripped from our culture. Even the word Freudian, like I said before, is frequently referenced in pop culture today, and thus has yet to fade. There's something enticing to people about the unconscious mind. Like our fascination with deep sea life, it's something that can only be speculated and theorized about. So my call to you is to gain a better knowledge about psychodynamic approach and some of the specific theories, and to make an informed decision as to whether or not to subscribe to these beliefs. Regardless, its relevance to psychology stays the same, and I personally believe that where the brain falters and the mind takes over is where psychoanalysis theories take place. Where science ends and creativity begins is where the psychodynamic thrives. Thank you.